This is Diana Everett-Snyder, and I'll be with you for the next hour. I'm going to read you something, as I always do, and it's from a book titled The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffith. If you have not read this book, I highly recommend it. If all banks could be forced to issue loans in the same ratio to their reserves as other banks did, then regardless of how small that ratio was, the amount of checks to be cleared between them would balance in the long run. No major currency drains would ever occur. The entire banking industry might collapse under such a system, but not individual banks, at least not those that were part of the cartel. All would walk the same distance from the edge, regardless of how close it was. Under such uniformity, no individual bank could be blamed for failure to meet its obligations. The blame could be shifted instead to the economy, or government policy, or interest rates, or trade deficits, or the exchange value of the dollar, or even to the capitalist system itself. In 1910, such a banker's utopia had not yet been created. If the downtown bank began to lend at a greater ratio to its reserves than its competitors, the amount of checks which would come back to it for payment also would be greater. Thus, the bank which pursued a more reckless lending policy had to draw against its reserves in order to make payments to the more conservative banks, and when those funds were exhausted, it usually was forced into bankruptcy. Now, historian John Klein tells us this. The financial panics of 1873, 1884, 1893, and 1907 were in large part an outgrowth of reserve pyramiding and excessive deposit creation by reserve city banks. The panics were triggered by the currency drains, you see, that took place in periods of relative prosperity when banks were loaned up. In other words, the panics and the resulting bank failures were caused not by negative factors in the economy, but by the currency drains on the banks, which were loaned up to the point where they had practically no reserves at all. The banks didn't fail because the system was weak. The system failed because the banks were weak. This was a problem that brought 7 men over 1,000 miles to a tiny island off the shore of Georgia. Each was a potentially fierce competitor, but uppermost in their minds at that time were the so-called panics and the very real 1,748 failures of the preceding 2 decades. Somehow, they had to join forces. All right, I'm going to read you something else from this book called The Creature from Jekyll Island. The basic plan for the Federal Reserve System was drafted at this meeting held in November 1910 at the private resort of J.P. Morgan on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. Those who attended represented the great financial institutions of Wall Street and, indirectly, Europe as well. The reason for secrecy was simple. Had it been known that rival factions of the banking community had joined together, the public would have been alerted to the possibility that the bankers were plotting an agreement in restraint of trade, which of course is exactly what they were doing. What emerged was a cartel agreement with 5 objectives: stop the growing competition from the nation's newer banks, obtain a franchise to create money out of nothing for the purpose of lending, get control of the reserves of all banks so that the more reckless ones would not be exposed to currency drains and bank runs, get the taxpayer to pick up the cartel's inevitable losses, and convince Congress that the purpose was to protect the public. It was realized that the bankers would have to become partners with the politicians and that the structure of the cartel would have to be a central bank. The record shows that the Fed has failed to achieve its stated objectives. That is because those were never its true goals. As a banking cartel, and in terms of those 5 objectives, it has been an unqualified success. You see, it goes like this. Knowledge of the nature of money is essential to an understanding of the Federal Reserve, because contrary to common belief, the topic is neither mysterious nor complicated. For the purpose of studying this, money is defined as anything which is accepted as a medium of exchange. Building on that, you'll find that there are 4 kinds of money. There's commodities, receipt, fiat, and fractional. Precious metals were the first commodity money to appear in history, and ever since they've been proven by actual experience to be the only reliable base for an honest monetary system. Gold, as the basis of money, can take several forms. We know them: bullion, coins, and fully backed paper receipts. Let me say that again. Fully backed paper receipts. Man has been plagued throughout history with the false theory that the quantity of money is important, specifically that more money is better than less. This has led to perpetual manipulation and expansion of the money supply. Did you guys hear that? Perpetual manipulation and expansion of the money supply through such practices as coin clipping, debasement of the coin contact, and in later centuries, the issuance of more paper receipts than there was gold to back them. In every single case, these practices have led to economic and political disaster. In those rare instances where man has refrained from manipulating the money supply and has allowed it to be determined by free market production of the gold supply, the result has been prosperity and tranquility. Now, I talk about this a lot, this paradigm of prosperity and scarcity. It's crucial, to where we're heading currently. I don't know how many of you actually watch the mainstream media, but it is good for picking up the odd tidbit. And one of those tidbits, of course, is the 8 bankers that have died under, if you're wearing your tinfoil hat, mysterious circumstances. And if you're part of mainstream, well, they simply committed suicide. So I, again, don't know how many people look at the stock markets and stock charts, but it's very interesting if you go back to the year prior to 2008 and you look at the flow of the charts from 2007 through the crash of 2008 all the way up to right now, today. And what you see, if you look at that, is that originally, when in 2008, at the crash moment, we had 17% of the American civilian population own stock on the U.S. stock market. Subsequent to that, it has declined to 11%, while simultaneously, we've also seen enormous margins of profit. The bigger the companies that are trading on the stock market, the larger their profit has been. There is an excessive gorging going on in our stock market. At the same time, we have excessive printing of money to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. I don't know how many people know this, but we are a debt-based economy, something else that I talk about quite frequently. We just raised the debt ceiling again. And, the beginning of October of last year, when we had all this craziness towards the end of the year about our debt ceiling, every single time the U.S. can borrow more money, can raise the debt ceiling, you, your children, and your grandchildren are in jeopardy, absolutely devastating jeopardy. On the very first day after the debt ceiling was last raised, the debt jumped by $328 billion in a single day. The previous single-day increase record of $238 billion was set 2 years prior, and the total federal debt now exceeds $17 trillion, according to Treasury Department figures. Of course, there are mathematical formulas that dictate all sorts of things, and just so that you know, these mathematical formulas are hypothesized on things that have already been created. The evidence is already there. So it's not hard. It's not a difficult thing to understand. And it's the premise for the rest of the show, which I'm going to show you exactly how these things will affect you, do affect you, have affected you, and are going to continue to affect you in the most devastating of ways. And on that premise, there is something else that I want to read you naturally. And it's this, and you've all heard various forms of this. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. This is a famous statement and quite a provocative poem which has been attributed to Pastor Martin Niemöller about the cowardice of German intellectuals following the Nazis' rise to power and the subsequent purging of their chosen targets, group after group. Of course, there's some disagreement over the exact wording of the quotation and when it was created. And And the content of the quotation has actually been presented differently by Niemöller on different occasions. So on that note, it's important to understand that chosen targets are chosen group by group. It is a complete and utter misnomer that the Second World War was all about a Holocaust against the Jewish people. It was not a Holocaust against the Jewish people. It was a war perpetrated by bankers for profit, in which Jews and gypsies and intellectuals and many other subgroups were all chosen targets. Equally important to understand is that millions of Germans suffered during the Second World War. We like to think that they did not, because history is written by the victor, in this case the United States, apparently. This is patently not true. Many millions of Jewish people suffered. This is true. What is equally true is that many millions of German women were raped and traumatized and went on to live their lives traumatized by the events of the Second World War. We don't like to talk about this, but we must, we need to, and we will in future shows. All right, let me just put this aside. Recently, a think tank, one of the think tanks put out a paper which I mentioned in another show, and it generated quite a lot of emails. And so I'm going to read you one small piece from Harlan Ullman, who was the principal author of the Shock and Awe Doctrine and is now chairman of the Killowen Group, which advises government leaders as part of a big organization, bought and paid for by the government to advise them. And by the way, not all think tanks are like that. So here we go. Let me read. Without an extraordinary crisis, little is likely to be done to reverse or limit the damage imposed by failed or failing governance. He implies that only another 9/11 style catechism will enable the state to reassert its dominance while containing, reducing, and eliminating the danger posed by newly empowered non-state actors. And that's the key part of this, because in 2010, the Department of Homeland Affairs created a document which identified likely domestic terror threats. And for those of you who still don't know, the people who are listed are categorized as those that are most likely to be threats to the U.S., that's U.S. Incorporated, within the landmass of the United States of America, are veterans, people who grow their own food, people who use cash, people who homeschool, different religious groups. And here's one that you may not have thought about: middle-aged white men. And this is going to be the premise for the rest of our show. On that note, we have a guest, and his name is Ken Martin from Ohio. Ken, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Hi, how are you? Welcome.
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. So, did you heard the beginning premise of my introduction of you, and
yes.
So I've left it open because, of course, there are many other groups that have been targeted by the government. I would add to middle-aged white men, our autistic community, our elderly community as a broad blanket community, subgroup within our community. The only people that are absolutely protected today in this economy, in terms of jobs and in terms of government handouts, are female minority groups. That's the top category. Below that is minority groups. Somewhere in there is drug addicts and alcoholics. Ken, please, if you would, introduce yourself and let's get this boat rolling, this story on the road.
Okay, I'm Ken Martin. I'm 56 years old. I had a good job. Unfortunately, when the economy collapsed, the company that I worked for lost their contracts, and I inevitably ended up getting laid off. In the process of looking for another job, I sent out hundreds and thousands of resumes to different states. I sent resumes to New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Texas, Louisiana, Ohio, California, and I forget where else. I got no phone calls, and this went on for about a year. At the end of a year, my unemployment ran out, and I got a phone call, and it was for a job that I would consider not very desirable, but I would take it because I was in an emergency situation. They asked me the usual questions, and they asked me how much I was making at my previous job, the job that I got laid off from, and I told them I was making $40,000 a year. I told them what I did there, and they said thank you and hung up the phone and never called me back. In the meantime, my unemployment ran out, so I started living off of what was supposed to be my retirement savings. So I'm, looking for a job, living off my retirement savings. And as fate would have it, on September 7th, 2011, I was admitted into the hospital when I found out I had cancer, and the cancer threw me into renal failure, and I was in the hospital for 3 weeks, recovering from the renal failure. According to what my doctors told me, and according to my already present medical condition, I applied for Social Security disability. It took about a year and 3/4 to get my hearing, and my hearing finally came up. And in the hearing, my lawyer asked the judge, if the judge had received my medical records, and the judge said, yes, I received the claimant's medical records, and I reviewed them, and I agree that the claimant is disabled. So I thought, oh, thank God, this isn't going to be the horrendous nightmare that people are telling me it is. So we proceeded with the hearing. At the end of the hearing, the judge turned to the disability doctor in the hearing and asked the disability doctor, do you agree that the claimant is disabled? And the disability doctor said, no, the claimant is not disabled. He can do housework. And the judge turned to me and my lawyer and said, the claimant is not disabled. I will send you my decision in the mail within 15 days. And when I got the decision in the mail, the judge said that I lied in the hearing and that I was not disabled. So now I'm living on $189 a month in food stamps and $115 a month in state of Ohio disability financial aid. And I'm living in a subsidized apartment complex for people with disabilities. So that's where I stand right now.
Right. And, of course, as you and I have talked about before, while this is your story, it is indicative of hundreds and millions of stories, hundreds of thousands and millions of stories around the United States, which is not to detract from your story, and which is to illustrate a rather cruel irony that the United States of America perceives itself as the global power, not a global power, but the global power, and seeks to police the world, seeks to monitor atrocities around the world, while at home, millions of people who have paid into various programs and been upstanding citizens have been pulled down along with this unfolding banking, economic, paper asset forfeiture crisis through no fault of their own, obviously, since we know that all of these are engineered and manufactured by the banks with the politicians for their own nefarious ideologies, for lack of a better word, that encompasses a whole volume right there. And we open the papers daily, we put on the news daily to hear about how our country, in our name, is bombing other countries and killing other people to bring world peace. We'll be right back.
This is Bill Jasper with the New American Magazine. President Obama and the ruling class in Washington believe that you should have no privacy, no secrets. The NSA, the FBI, the IRS, and dozens of other agencies should have full authority at any time, without warrants, probable cause, or due process, to record your telephone conversations, emails, text messages, web page visits, financial transactions, travel, virtually everything concerning you. Elected officials and appointed bureaucrats insist that we citizens must give up more and more of our privacy. At the same time, they believe the federal government should be able to operate in complete secrecy, unaccountable to we the people. You think this sounds too far-fetched? But is it? Case in point, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. It's a secret, so-called trade agreement that is on track to be completed by the end of 2013. You can expect President Obama to call on Congress to approve the TPP in early 2014. If you are not familiar with the TPP, you are not alone. Many may not recall, but President Obama mentioned it as a top goal in his 2013 State of the Union address.
Now, even as we protect our people, we should remember that today's world presents not just dangers, not just threats, it presents opportunities. To boost American exports, support American jobs, and level the playing field in the growing markets of Asia, we intend to complete negotiations on a Trans-Pacific Partnership. And tonight I'm announcing that we will launch talks on a comprehensive transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the European Union, because trade that is fair and free across the Atlantic supports millions of good-paying American jobs.
Besides the State of the Union address, the only other mention of the agreements has been the minimal coverage by the mainstream media. Usually, they promote it as agreements that will increase trade and thereby generate vast numbers of new jobs for Americans. What is not being promoted is that the TPP and TTIP negotiations have been going on in secret for quite some time. The Obama administration has repeatedly rejected requests by members of the House of Representatives and the Senate for texts of the agreements. Incredibly, while the Obama administration denies access and information to the officials whom the American people have elected to represent them, it gives special access to big corporations, labor unions, and stakeholders whom the administration has selected to represent the American people in so-called advisory committees. So why all the secrecy? What aren't they telling us? Contact your representatives now to stop the TPP and find out more at thenewamerican.com, where we have been exposing the dangers of the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Hey, this is Diana Everett Snyder. I'm here with my guest, Ken Martin. Earlier I had read a poem by Martin Niemöller, First They Came for the Socialists, which is really the premise of our show today. We've all been exposed to this poem. We've all been exposed to a history of the Second World War and the First World War. We've all talked amongst ourselves about the various things going on in the government, and wondering what the heck the politicians are up to. We've talked about the NDAA and the updates to the NDAA that President Obama has signed into law, and the amendments with very little coverage that have replaced some easier wording on the previous NDAA. We've seen a lot of coverage, or speculation rather, on the Trans-Pacific Pact Alliance, and very little, of course, is known about it, although you have to be terribly, terribly, terribly concerned when even our corrupt politicians, and they're all corrupt, some more so than others, or more glaringly, obviously, than others, but when they are all complaining and are all disgruntled because they have not been privy to the negotiations, the discussions, and the tactics behind the signing the inking of the deal to the Trans-Pacific Pact Alliance, you have to know that something is most assuredly not right. I've also previously covered Kelly Thomas and the Fullerton death by cop, as I like to call it. And it's something I was on Ron Thomas's website, which is Kelly Thomas's father. And there's something there that I found rather simple, which I want to read you. And it says, "We are the people, we are anonymous, and we are all one." And that's why I came here today, because we all know someone who has fallen on hard times if we ourselves are not that person. But it's very hard to put yourself in that position. It's very hard to think what it would be like to suddenly not have your home, to not have a car, to have no resources whatsoever. We've all grown up in a first world country where we very much take for granted those things that we have, that we view as entitlements. We take our cell phones for granted. We take for granted the fact that we can turn on our lights and have light at night. We take for granted that we can turn on the water and drink from the tap, turn on the water, take a shower, open the refrigerator and eat from it, have a stove to cook on, have a roof over our head. And it is by the grace of God and good luck that it is not you and you and you and me. And tomorrow it could be. And in that we are all the same. Because no one is speaking up. And the drumbeat continues. There is not enough action. There is too much inertia. There is too much apathy. Something else that I like to talk about a lot is the issue with our police departments around the United States. And I like to point out, I don't like to point out, I'm forced to point out the fact that our police departments are increasingly militarized under the Department of Homeland Affairs. They are increasingly being dressed like soldiers, armed like soldiers, and trained like soldiers. Increasingly under the Department of Homeland Affairs, they are being sent out into our urban environments and told that they're fighting a war on domestic terrorism. Those are our streets. On their target practice pieces of paper, at their military training academies, at their weekend warrior training camps, during live drills, the picture that you see is not a round bullseye target. It is a picture of a clean-faced teenager holding a submachine gun. It is a picture of a white, pregnant woman with a bag of groceries. It is a bunch of white men in suits. These are the sorts of images that are being printed onto targets and used by police departments around the United States to desensitize them to the fact that they will be shooting not at some dire threat to their own bodily safety or the threat of a neighborhood, but at who is being targeted and who's to say who their target is. But increasingly we also see in the news media the extreme police violence. Of course, Kelly Thomas is a perfect example of that, and he's also now the perfect example of our civilian inertia and apathy, because there was a trial. There were 6 police involved in the beating death of Kelly Thomas. 2 of those officers went on to trial and were found by the jury to be innocent of the death, the subsequent death of Kelly Thomas. One has to wonder if they know about jury nullification. One has to know if they know about the law regarding how a judge may instruct a jury. And if you go and you read the transcript of the court case itself, and you listen to the opening and closing statements of both legal teams, you understand very clearly that this particular case was not about whether Kelly Thomas had died, whether he deserved it, what the circumstances surrounding this event were. The premise of the entire case rested on whether these police officers were doing their jobs or stepped outside of the jurisdiction of doing their jobs. And so by setting these men free, a legal premise has been enacted that will be used in future cases of extreme police violence against the civilian population. And if you are listening to this show, you are the civilian population. You are the target, much like Ken has been the target of what is coming more and more to a house next door to you. So Ken, let's get into some details. Tell me, again, how much money it is that you're getting every month.
I'm getting $115 a month on the State of Ohio Disability Financial Assistance Program, and I get $189 a month on food stamps, and I'm also on Medicaid.
Okay. And so you're in a subsidized housing now. Now, when I met you a couple years ago, you, of course, were living with some friends, and it was extremely stressful because they, too, were struggling somewhat. And ultimately, you had no choice but to move into a shelter, which to anyone is absolutely devastating, especially to someone who has always been able to pay their bills, has been gainfully employed, and been a successful human being. So
Correct.
you had belongings that needed a place to stay. You had your own flesh and blood person, which needed a roof over his head, and you had a vehicle. Now, I know that you had to sell a whole lot of stuff and ended up giving away a whole lot of stuff, and then you moved into the shelter. Now, how long were you at the shelter?
I was at the shelter for 10 months.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about that experience, if you would.
Oh,
I know it's loaded.
let's just say it's not something that you want to do. It was a learning experience for me because I was not fully aware of the kind of people that live in shelters. Everything that I had heard on NPR and other radio stations was saying that the rate of homelessness among people my age was increasing because of the collapse of the economy and sending jobs overseas, people losing their jobs.
Okay, hold on.
The number of homeless sleeping each night in the New York City shelter system has surpassed 50,000 people for the first time in 3 decades. According to a report by the Coalition for the Homeless, more children and adults are homeless now in New York City than at any time since the Great Depression.
In the last 7 years, thousands and thousands of families in New York City have lost their jobs. They have become unemployed. And rents, the cost of housing in New York is so high that they can't afford to pay rent. So even though they're working, or they've become recently unemployed, there's thousands of them who have no place to live.
While many turn to shelters, a skyrocketing number of people have sought refuge in the city's subway stations and carts, notably in the brutally cold winter months. According to the city's annual HOPE NYC Street Survey, there were more than 1,800 people living on the subways in 2013, up from 1,000 in 2009.
The shelters are sometimes dangerous. You have people in a closed space together. There's a lot of mental illness, and there's also drug use. And for children, moms and dads who are working and have children who are homeless, they have fear sometimes when they go into the shelter. So weirdly, oddly, they prefer to sleep on a subway train than to go into the shelter mainly because of the conditions of personal safety.
Last week, it was reported that transit workers and the NYPD had set up a plan to clear homeless men and women out of the subway system starting Monday at 3 a.m. However, after facing opposition by advocacy groups and a report in the local news outlet DNA Info, they were forced to tone down their language, insisting the so-called, quote, outreach program was to be voluntary. With the homeless population above and below ground at an all-time high, many believe significant progress will only come about with an increased supply of permanent housing for families and support services for the mentally ill. Susan Madaris, Press TV, New York.
As many as 6 times a day, Faith Keating gives her 6-month-old son Tommy treatment for a respiratory condition brought on by the cold. Keating has lived in this shelter with her 4 children since December. She came from Missouri to find a job.
We're always outside. We're always in the cold. I don't have a car, so it's either taking the bus or walking.
So how does the weather affect you day to day?
Yeah, I have to figure out, are we risking somebody getting sick again? Or somebody getting worse than they already are.
Across the upper Midwest, temperatures are 10 to 35 degrees below normal. Chicago's low was 2 degrees. Grand Forks, North Dakota was 11 below. This photo, taken from space, shows nearly 80% of the Great Lakes covered in ice. In Minnesota, mail carriers have been unable to make deliveries to mailboxes buried in snow.
Ready?
Back in Illinois, Keating says she's unsure when her family will move out of the shelter.
Is the weather stopping you from being able to get back on your feet?
It's definitely making things a lot harder.
Unfortunately, it is only going to get worse. The overnight low for the northern plains is negative 20. Scott, that wind chill will be negative 40.
Anita, thanks very much.
I want to announce today that we will be providing the Kingdom of Jordan a $1 billion loan guarantee fund that will help Jordan access the international capital markets, as well as extend for 5 years the memorandum of understanding that we have with the Kingdom of Jordan that allows that country to pursue the kind of development that will not only help the people of Jordan but help the region as a whole.
For more news, visit youtube.com/pigmind5.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.
All right, Ken, let's go back one sentence so that we can keep ourselves focused here. You had said that you had been told that homelessness in the middle-aged population was increasing, and you thought.
Yes. Yes, and I thought that at the homeless shelter, that's what type of person would be there. When I got there, I found out that there's a lot of people in homeless shelters who have serious psychiatric problems. It was drug addicts and alcoholics, and I had to put up with things like death threats and my property being stolen, like my wallet being stolen, my cell phone being stolen, my car keys being stolen, stuff like that. Fights broke out frequently among the residents, and it was just, when
now,
this apartment opened up,
How many beds were in that particular homeless shelter?
I'm sorry, you're breaking up.
How many beds were in that homeless shelter? And on that, were there private rooms? How many people to a room? How many bathrooms?
There were 26 beds, and there were 4 people to a room, and the bathroom had 3 stalls and 3 showers. Plus, it had a laundering facility.
So you were able to do your laundry there?
Yes, it was actually, as homeless shelters go, this was like the top-of-the-line homeless shelter. It had a kitchen, it had a living space, it had a laundry facility, shower facility. It was actually a very good program. It's a private shelter sponsored and supported by the Catholic Church. And it's actually a very good shelter. The staff there was very supportive of me. I became friends with a couple of the staff members. We talked about what was happening, and I told them what happened to me, and they were just like, this is unbelievable. I said, tell me about it. I never thought in a million years I'd ever be in a situation like this. And I figured from time to time life would deal me some crap, but I never, ever thought that it would be anything like this. Ever.
Okay, so you were there almost a year, and you were on a list, correct, for subsidized housing.
Yes, the lady at the apartment complex said it would take anywhere from 6 months to a year for an apartment to open up.
Uh-huh. So you qualified, and then you were told that you could move on in. And in the meantime, of course, you're living on how much a month?
$115 a month state disability. My rent's $25 a month, and that includes the utilities. So what I do is I take the $115 out of off my card every month. I pay the $25 a month rent, and then the other $90 I send that to my credit card so that they don't shut off my credit card. And things like soap, shampoo, laundry detergent, dish detergent, and stuff that the food stamp card won't buy, I drop onto my credit card, like car insurance, gas for the car, shampoo, soap, laundry detergent, stuff like that.
Right. Now, how much do you get in food stamps a month?
It was $200, but supposedly the cost of living came down, so they cut the food stamps down to $189 a month.
Well, I don't know about Ohio, but I'm in California, and I can tell you that it sure as hell hasn't gone down. In fact, it's gone up, while simultaneously corporate salary increases, cost of living increases are hovering at around 3% for people. And
well, my car insurance went up.
Right, and it's not keeping current with the increasing prices. So, and corporations don't care, because if an employee complains, they're let go. I've spoken to far too many people, both in the corporate industry, who manage and micromanage this philosophy, as well as having spoken to too many people on the receiving end of this corporate philosophy to believe otherwise. Corporations do not care if they are not keeping current with the economy and the drive upward, and therefore the downturn in people's ability to keep up with their bills. They don't care, because there is a line around the corner of people desperate to find some sort of work to subsidize their existence on this planet. So the idea that $189 can feed a person adequately for 30 days, or for this month, 28 days, doesn't matter, is ludicrous. It's absolutely ridiculous. So, okay, so you pay $25 in rent, and you send $90 to your credit card so that you can drive your car, so that you can keep current on your car insurance, so that you can use your credit card to subsidize what the food stamps do not cover. Things like toilet paper, shampoo, what else?
Yes, all that. Yeah, toilet paper, shampoo, soap, laundry detergent, dish detergent, because I don't want to live like a pig.
Right. I mean, one has to, in order to stay
I'm trying
healthy.
to maintain as much civility as I can here, so,
Well,
$115
so
a month doesn't do much.
Right, and so this is the whole thing, and this is important to talk about, because, we talk about the numbers, but the numbers don't mean much unless you can relate them to tangible things. And so we can talk about, the banks, and we can talk about the economy, and we can talk about the stock market, and we can talk about our politicians and the fact that it doesn't matter who you are, you can never reach a damn one of them while they're busy drawing their salary and living their fantasy lifestyles at our expense. You are unable to get a hold of them. And we'll cover that in a second. And so we can talk about all of those things in a very esoteric manner. But the reason I keep going over these numbers with you is because I really want people, regardless of how much you currently earn, regardless of whether you're earning, because $40,000 is the median middle-class salary across the United States. Yes, it differs for various states. Cost of living differs for various states. This is true. But the median middle-class income for the United States is $40,000. And, of course, we have this thing that we've been inculcated with called the American dream, where everyone supposedly is entitled to a home and a white picket fence and a cell phone and an SUV and all that other stuff and all the toys. Now, if you understand that at any moment in time you could be, and in fact most likely are, on one of those target group lists so clearly defined by our Department of Homeland Affairs, put yourself in the position of thinking about how you would live for a month on $115, disability, mind you, and $189 in food stamps, and exactly how much you would be able to afford that you have now. Imagine losing your home that you have put sweat equity into, that houses your belongings and keeps your children out of the inclement weather, and is the proverbial home that you stick your key into when you come home at the end of a working day. How would you cope on $189 in food stamps? So, Ken, you pay $90 a month on your credit card so that you can keep using your credit card. Now, yes. Then what? What happens when $90 is not enough to pay on your credit card? What happens then?
Well, I'm in trouble. I mean, I'll have to sell my car to pay the credit card balance off so that I can keep using the credit card. And in the meantime, hope that the appeals committee reviews my case and, looks at my medical records and says, you know what, this guy is disabled. The judge was right the first time around. His medical records clearly state that he has physical limitations and impedances, and he is disabled. Let's give him his disability. That's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that happens before more disaster sets in, because there is no public transportation here. If I have to sell my car, I am literally, and I mean literally, stranded.
Okay,
and not to
mention, Ken, that they've also told you that the appeal could take up to 3 years. In all likelihood, it may not, but it could take 3 years. Now, behind you, because you've been in a situation for some years now, but behind you comes the people who lost their unemployment benefits in December, right around Christmas time and New Year. So behind you, down the road and around the corner and encompassing the entire perimeter of the United States is the rest of the people who are becoming you. So in all likelihood, the courts are going to be stopped up and backed up, and everything is going to grind slower. The red tape is going to unfurl at a much slower rate. So what happens when you have to sell your car, you no longer have a vehicle, and it still hasn't been reviewed by the review board? And I want to point out that Ken qualifies on all, is it 5 or 7 points?
It's It's 7 points that you have to meet, and I meet all 7 of the points. My age, my physical limitations, my medical condition, my current income status, and I forget what the other points are, but I meet all 7 points.
Okay, so when you and I had spoken last, I mean, that was an important distinction, and it remains, of course, a critical distinction to make, is that we have a system set up, and when people meet all the criteria on the system that is set up and are then denied in the court system, that is not so much a broken system as a broken court system. Because if you qualify for 7 out of 7 of the qualifiers, there is absolutely no reason for a judge to deny it. Please think about this coming week. We are marching to a drum. This is Diane Everett Snyder. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Out of the West, still in the grip of a severe drought, where federal water officials are turning off their taps as well. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation announced yesterday that there will be no federal water deliveries this year to most farmers in California's Central Valley. As Carter Evans reports, that's really bad news for a region responsible for half of America's produce.
With 0% water, if we don't have enough water to irrigate this field, this whole system is going to be left dry.
The fields on Joe Del Bosque's farm should be lush with tomatoes, cherries, and melons.
What I grow here in cantaloupes feeds about 2.5 million people their annual consumption of cantaloupes. On just one farm.
Now farmers here in California's Central Valley are leaving 500,000 acres unplanted. Del Bosque is using what's left of his water supplies to keep his almond trees alive.
It was no surprise, but, reality does start to sink in now.
250 miles south in Los Angeles, produce distributor Jesse Martin expects a squeeze on the nation's supply of fresh fruit.
This time of the year, you can import fruit from other countries.
Yes, we do.
But when it comes to summertime,
there's no fruit anywhere else to import.
And vegetables, too. California's Central Valley grows at least 70% of the country's broccoli, cauliflower, and celery.
What's that going to do to prices?
Prices are going to go up.
Are we talking about just a few pennies more expensive?
No, we're talking dollars. If last year you were able to buy something for 79 cents a pound, well, you're going to have to filter. You're going to pay $1.29 or $1.49.
Several cities near San Francisco also rely heavily on the federal water supply. On Friday, they were told they may only receive half of their water allocation this year. For CBS This Morning Saturday, Carter Evans, Los Angeles.
The next time you buy that Granny Smith apple or that grass-fed steak, you'll likely be paying more. With a severe drought impacting farms across western states, yields are down and prices are going up.
We should be getting more local mushrooms in, mostly from Mendocino. But because there's no rain, the chanterelles are coming from Europe. They can get as low as $9 a pound when it's a good year. Right now they're $45 a pound.
Everything from nuts to melons to greens, all grown in California's dry Central Valley, are being affected. But the hardest hit food industry right now may be cattle.
You're seeing dairy production down. You're seeing people having to cull their herds, specifically cattle. This will impact not only the cost of grass-fed beef, but there will likely be no 100% grass-fed beef available from California this year.
Any price with that?
There's plenty of anxiety about the rising food prices at this food truck park, where owners are contemplating cutting already small profit margins or passing the rising food costs on to customers.
Are we going to have to cut down on some of the wages, get rid of people, or are we going to bring the prices up, and our customers then going to think that it's too expensive for them to come back and visit us. I mean, it's something that you gotta really think about.
Food industry analyst Phil Lambert says for every $100 you usually spend at the grocery store, you can now expect to pay at least an extra $10 at the checkout, with food prices continuing to increase if the drought gets worse. Haven Daily, Associated Press, San Francisco.
Even before this rough winter in the east and south and the current drought in the west, extreme weather had been pushing food prices up over the past several years. Even so, the government's consumer price index is showing little or no inflation. And try telling that to shoppers in the supermarket checkout line. Here's Michelle Miller.
I'd like the government to stop by my house, come food shopping with me, and see where the real costs are.
Writer Jen Singer, mother of 2 teenage boys, wrestles with her grocery list every week to keep the household budget from getting away from her.
We go through one of these every couple days. It's a big part of my take-home pay. An apple a day, can't afford it at these prices. Save 90 cents.
It's not her imagination. While the government says prices are up 6.4% since 2011, chicken is up 18.4%, ground beef up 16.8%, and bacon has skyrocketed up 22.8%.
Oh my God.
Making it a holiday when it's on sale.
Bacon for $3. Things that are going up in price are the things that I absolutely need to buy. It's the meat, it's the milk, it's the eggs, and it's getting out of hand. $8.32 for this.
Convergex market strategist Nick Polis.
Moms can really tell the government a lot about inflation. Food inflation is far greater than the government thinks it is.
But the big problem for families, wages are not budging.
If my income isn't going up, how am I going to keep up with inflation?
Median income is up only 1% a year. For Singer, that makes it hard to save for college tuition, which has been rising 6 to 8% every year for 5 decades.
The price of college is terrifying. And so we're looking at cheaper schools or scholarships, I hope. Run faster in track. That would really help me out a lot.
Many are concerned that while economists paint a benign picture, middle-class families are quietly struggling.
The disconnect is severe because it's the economists that make policy, but it's the people that have to live with the outcome of that policy, and that disconnect is growing to the point where I think it has to break soon.
For more news, visit youtube.com/pigmine5.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.